About 2 hours outside Frankfurt lies the town of Schweinfurt. Dating back to 791, it's one of the oldest towns in Bavaria. Today, Schweinfurt is part of an auto industry that's at the center of Germany's modern industrial might.
The auto industry is really the backbone of Germany.
German car makers are among the most famous in the world. Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen. But supporting the iconic brands is a vast network of parts manufacturers. One of them is the Job Group, based near Schweinfurt.
So we are the main machining plant here of our headquarters.
Its CEO is Martin Buchs.
We are an automotive supplier, mainly, for maybe 80% of our business. We're supplying directly to the OEMs, the vehicle manufacturers, and supplying to the Tier 1 suppliers that supply to the vehicle manufacturers like Audi, Mercedes, Volkswagen, Porsche. So you can find our parts in all of these vehicles.
But the German auto industry is facing stiff headwinds. Germany employed over 800,000 auto workers in 2018, a number that fell to just over 720,000 last year. And it isn't just auto manufacturing that's down. The German manufacturing sector overall employed around 5.5 million people at the end of September 2025. That's 2% less than a year earlier.
China is really a challenge for the German automotive landscape at the moment. With the rise of the battery electric vehicle, which has gained now 17% market share here in Europe as well, access to battery technology is much more difficult for German OEMs. Access to raw material is much more difficult. And the Chinese OEMs, there has been a lot of new OEMs actually coming up. I think it's about 100 in China. So competition in China is very tough actually. And the export of components and vehicles from Germany to China has decreased significantly. We're a family business. Yeah, we have a long-term relationship with our employees. But programs from our customers were postponed. We had volume drops, so we had to react. Not only last year, but for the last couple of years, we had to adjust. We had to close 2 plants. We had to do some restructurings, and we had to lay off around about 500 people. So coming from 2,000 now to 1,500. But actually, we had to do it.
If this sounds familiar, consider the United States at the turn of the century, specifically the year 2001.
China joins the World Trade Organization. This is a very productive, fast, rapidly advancing country, and then barriers were removed, they became more competitive.
David Autor is a professor of economics at MIT and co-director of the Labor Studies program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He and his co-authors popularized the term China shock in a 2016 paper on the impacts of the country's economic rise.
And it really, especially for the United States, it displaced a lot of U.S. production. And this really did great rapid damage to manufacturing intensive locations that were making, commodity furniture, they're making textiles and fabrics, clothing, toys, games, assembly, and so on. And so on the scale of U.S. employment, it wasn't that large. On the scale of the places that were most affected, it was quite devastating.
China shock hit parts of the U.S. hard. Autor and his co-authors estimate that it accounted for nearly 60% of all U.S. manufacturing job losses between 2001 and 2019.
I think that the U.S. did 2 things wrong. First, we just let it rip. There was no gradualism about it. And with labor markets, you really don't want to just rip the Band-Aid off, because labor markets have a natural rate of adjustment of a couple percent per year, because that's the rate at which people retire and new people enter. And people make those transitions by choosing new occupations at entry or retiring from old ones. You don't go mid-career from being a lawyer to being a manufacturing worker or vice versa. And so you don't want things to change that fast. You can handle change, but at a gradual rate. We didn't do anything to buffer that shock. The other is we had no real social policies in place to help people, to help communities, and to help people adjust.
The China shock dealt a blow to labor-intensive manufacturing like automobiles and textiles. Something similar may be playing out across Europe now as Chinese exports to Europe surge and prices of some goods collapse. French President Emmanuel Macron calls the trade imbalance, quote, unbearable. And Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission said that the bloc's relationship with China has reached, quote, an inflection point.
Europe has been one of those markets, and Chinese exports to Europe are growing very rapidly, and they threaten to displace a lot of European manufacturing that remains, most visibly in the automotive sector, and in Germany most of all. And this is going to, I think, have similar risks for them in terms of hollowing out sectors really rapidly.
Europe's so-called China shock seems to have been triggered in part by U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, leading China to look for new markets. But, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, it often rhymes. And this time it may be different for Europe than it was for the U.S.
There was this sense of, oh, well, all of the exports that were going to the US, because there has been a big reduction in Chinese imports coming into the US, there's a feeling that those goods are just being diverted to Europe and elsewhere. And that we're not quite seeing that in the numbers.
Stephanie Flanders runs economics and government for Bloomberg News and thinks the story is more complicated than China flooding Europe's markets.
We are seeing that China has successfully offset the impact of US tariffs by trading more with other countries. But it actually, if anything, seems to be different goods. And it seems to have been done through, cutting the price of some of those different goods that they're used to selling to Europe. So, as ever with trade numbers, it's just a bit complicated. But it is certainly true that China, on the face of it, has not been affected as much as you would have thought from the big reduction in exports going to the U.S.
The U.S. trade deficit has been falling since Liberation Day, when President Trump announced sweeping tariffs on imports from many countries. But fewer Chinese exports to the U.S. did not mean China's exports overall went down. To the contrary, it now has a $1.2 trillion trade surplus, as its exports have actually increased.
So the increase has been quite widely spread, David, because obviously the rest of the world as a market is bigger than the US. But the headline numbers are, you've seen about just over a 4 percentage point reduction in Chinese exports to the US. But actually overall, the exports last year increased by 3%. So they'd actually more than offset that swing in their exports to the US. And that's been spread over, I think the place that had the biggest increase is Africa, albeit from a small base. They've seen a lot more Chinese exports. And Europe, other places have also seen more, but it's more on the order of sort of 1.5% growth.
Another difference in this China shock is the kind of goods China is exporting all over the world.
If you're mostly just importing without exporting, you're just accumulating trade deficits, that means that it's not obvious where all those people are supposed to go. There's not a new set of activities opening up simultaneously. So I think it's quite a challenge. It was quite a challenge for the United States. We didn't manage it particularly well. And I think it's actually in many ways more challenging now than it was 20 years ago because China has moved so far up the value chain. When the China shock hit the United States in 2000, China was not exporting automobiles. But now they're a world-class auto supplier, and they're the best producer of electric vehicles in the world. There's a huge car industry in Europe, particularly in Germany, and they feel very threatened, and understandably so. But it will not just be in automotive, but it'll also be in heavy industry like rail cars and shipping, but also be in lots of consumer goods. And so China is a formidable competitor, and not just in low value-added, labor-intensive manufacturing the way it was 20 years ago, but in really all the high-tech sectors and all the consumer products that are, kind of central to, both what consumers purchase, but also what a lot of advanced economy manufacturers produce.
Martin Book sees that happening already. To adapt, his company is turning to an area that isn't affected by China's reach and manufacturing dominance. Defense.
We do around about 80% of our revenue in automotive, but part of our strategy is to diversify into other areas. We are already doing some supplying to semiconductors, some to medical, to the general industry, but we would like to do more in defense and space, actually. That's part of our roadmap, a 10-year roadmap. And we are already supplying to the drone industry, which has become much more important now because of the Ukraine-Russian war. And we have some more plans for 26. That's going to be announced in the second half of this year. We have some plans to come forward with our core competence, actually, which is mechanic and mechatronic products.
Defense spending is government spending, which means it has to be paid for through taxation or borrowing. So it's not, you can't run your economy just by making defense goods for yourself, but that will use some of European industrial capacity and perhaps give focus to some of what they're doing and also technological advance. They also will face the same supply chain constraints the United States does. A lot of our military inputs come from China, including, for example, rare earth metals.
The German case, it has been quite dramatic in these sectors that had previously been, absolutely at the heart of Germany's kind of self-identity as a manufacturing power, machine tools and cars. I think the only thing that's kind of offsetting that in terms, which is quite a big thing in terms of growth overall in Germany, is of course they're the ones they're increasing dramatically their defence spending, and they're getting a fiscal impulse from that, which is not really present in the same way in other countries. So we are seeing a lot of structural change hitting Germany at the same time, partly as a result of Donald Trump's trade policies with respect to China and other places, but also as a result of being in a more scary world.
But where China makes life harder for some European manufacturers, it is lending a helping hand to central banks.
Annoyingly for those sitting in central banks, the numbers, it's hard to tease out the data because it always tends to be a bit behind the curve. But we are seeing not so much the volume changing, the overall value of trade changing, but within that, maybe more goods at a lower price. And actually the reduction in price may actually be helping to pull down inflation in some of these countries.
And does that relieve some pressure on the European Central Bank?
Well, I think it's one of those things. We've heard some Bank of England policymakers and European Central Bank policymakers talk about it. They're obviously at a period, the European Central Bank has been on hold for a long time. They've been adjusting their inflation forecasts. A lot of people, including Bloomberg's economists, think that inflation is going to undershoot the Eurozone's target this year, and that they should potentially be looking to cut rates further.
If we are witnessing a sort of second coming for China, it's coming in some very different ways, in the products it is making and in the regions it is exporting to, with different economic effects. But, as before, some particular sectors and geographic areas could be hit harder than others. Just ask Martin Books.
We are a family business. Yeah, I'm living in an area. Of course, it's not easy to lay off people in an area where you live, where you meet people in shops every day. Yeah, but at the end of the day, it's about survival in the industry. And I think the case was quite clear that it was necessary to reduce our labor.